What's up, YouTube? Welcome to the 3.18 Lightning Strike Berserker guide. Now, I decided to make a guide because everyone was requesting one because they were all wondering what changes were made in the 3.18 version of this build. Now, I did change up a few things, so if you're not going to pay attention to the full video, I'm going to go over the key changes at the start. So if you already know pretty much everything there is to know about the Lightning Strike Berserker from 3.17, you can just watch the beginning and you'll pretty much be caught up. But the rest of the guide is pretty similar, but I do go over some new item choices that I made. Now you can see here, if you haven't actually played the build before, you can see the build pretty much absolutely demolishes the fear once you get enough gear. And it is pretty much a joy to play with how fast you attack. It's a very fast play style, so I think a lot of people will enjoy it. So the key changes for the build is that we're going to be running Perseverance on the Berserker. Now, Perseverance previously was an item that was thought to be mainly for champions only, but it turns out that Perseverance with around like 40k armor and 40k evasion actually is pretty much unbeatable in damage. So what Perseverance does is it gives you 1% attack damage per 200 in armor and evasion, whichever one is lower. So if you have 40k armor and evasion, that means you have roughly 200% attack damage on the belt. Now, another good thing about the belt is it also gives you onslaught while fortified. And because we pretty much have fortified up almost the entire time, this means that we'll be having onslaught up permanently while not having to use the cluster jewel. Because before in the past, we had to use the Warcry cluster, lead by example. So this will allow us to get a power spike earlier on in the league, right? Before we're able to switch to a cluster setup. It's a very, very big power spike. But I do think that Perseverance could be quite expensive because there are quite a few people trying out Lightning Strike this time around on the champion. Now, another change that I made was that I switched up the tree a little bit to take point blank. So the reason behind taking point blank is that Vol Lightning Strike's damage is pretty much almost all projectiles. So there's no point in using Ancestral War Chief as much. And Ancestral War Chief, if we cut it out, we are able to free up enough sockets in order to use a Divine Blessing aura, right? So this also is an added benefit because we don't need to press as many buttons for bossing, so we no longer need to drop 2 totems. And now we pretty much just need to put down 1 totem, and then we can put down Vol Lightning Strike. So overall, the build should be a lot more smooth to play, and there should be a lot more emphasis on the Vol Lightning Strike damage so that you can one-shot the map bosses as smoothly as possible. So these are the frequently asked questions that I always get every single time. At this point, I've done this guide like 2 leagues in a row, and these are the questions that always trip everyone up, right? Number 1 is how to fix the mana issue. Well, this time around, the tree is configured differently, so we end up taking this life and mana leech node. So as long as you take this node, you will no longer have any mana issues for your build. And eventually, if you switch to a cluster setup and you take Fuel to Fight, which gives you 0.4% of attack damage least as mana, then you can actually drop this node and save a passive skill point. So now, no more mana issues for anyone as long as you take this point while leveling. And next up, we have why do I deal low damage? Now, the reason you deal low damage is because your Trinity support gem is messed up, or you're not taking advantage of snapshotting with Vol Lightning Strike. So what snapshotting means is that when you cast the Vol Lightning Strike, for the duration of the Vol Lightning Strike, it takes your character snapshot from when you casted it, right? So you can make sure to press all your Flasks, you can make sure you have Berserk up, you can make sure you have high rage when you cast Vol Lightning Strike. Now, in order to fix Trinity, you should go look at your calculus, and you should make sure that you have 2 elements that can take turns being the highest damage. So you can see here that lightning damage and fire damage can take turns being the highest because of how high the damage range is on lightning and how low the damage range is on lightning, right? So these 2 elements can take turns being the highest. Now, another question I commonly get is when should I swap to Lightning Strike? Because this build does level with Spectral Helix. Now, you should swap whenever you have alternate ailments, which you can get with Gale Sight or Secrets of Suffering, or you get a 6 link. I think either of these conditions should give you enough of a power spike so that Lightning Strike can do red maps and red map bosses with ease. And you also want to make sure you have strike additional enemy on a tree or Eldritch Implicit on the gloves, right? So you can either choose to take this node here, Tribal Fury, or you can make sure your gloves have strike skills target 1 additional nearby enemy from the Eldritch Implicits. So those are pretty much all the questions that people always ask. So let's go over the pros and cons for the build real fast, just in case you're new and you haven't played the build before. Pretty much the pros are the build is an absolute late game powerhouse, probably one of the best scaling builds in the game because all of the more multipliers. Berserk is really a drug because with Berserk, your character feels like it is on Super Saiyan mode. And you have a pretty strong power curve throughout the whole game in that there's always upgrades that you can find at every single level until you max out the character. And these upgrades can cost like 1x to like 100x. So you'll always have something to upgrade at all currency levels. And also the build is pretty tanky because you get access to Fortify and Berserk gives you damage reduction. Berserk gives you up to 26% damage reduction, and Berserk is something you can pretty much keep up like 60 to 70% of the time while bossing. The build also has amazing map clear speed due to strike skills target additional enemies, so you can pretty much strike 3 times for one attack if there's two mobs nearby, the main mob you're trying to hit. And the build also has strong recovery. Recovery is always something that matters a lot for bossing. So you can see here the life leech on hit rate is 14, 15 life per second, right? And this is because the claw gives you 46 life gain for each enemy hit by your attack, so you can leech back a huge amount of life. Now, the main cons for the build is you have to play Spectral Helix for leveling and early mapping. Spectral Helix is just too strong of a skill, and you will probably have a better time playing Spectral Helix than trying to force another skill like Earth Shatter or something like that. Now, Pebbles do block a lot of projectiles in that you will not be able to actually use Lightning Strike and have to, and like a tree could block it and you will stop being able to do damage. Now, there's also a lot of buttons to press on this build compared to other builds in that you have Withering Step and you have to press Berserk compared to the champion build. And there's a lot of socket pressure, meaning that it's kind of annoying to try to make the sockets work out. And you do have to drop some things like faster attacks on Whirling Blades or something like that. Now, next up, we're going to go over the build mechanics. Now, Vol Lightning Strike is a strike skill. And what strike skills are good for is that you can strike additional enemies. In that, if there's one additional enemy, your Lightning Strike will go off twice. And if you have two additional enemies, you can attack up to 3 times. So you can be pretty much doing 3 times damage if you have the glove implicit that gives you strike skills target 2 additional nearby enemies. Now, Vol Lightning Strike can be snapshotted, like I said earlier, and that Vol Lightning Strike will take your character's profile from when you casted it, right? And it lasts for, I think, 6 seconds or so. Yeah, base duration is 6 seconds. Now, Lightning Strike is also able to hit with the melee and projectile component if you stand at the correct distance. So you pretty much need to be like 2 character distance away from the mob you're trying to attack. And Lightning Strike allows you to hit with the melee and the projectile. So if you look at Pob right here, you can see if you look at Lightning Strike, there's a melee component and a projectile component. So what this means is that when you do single target, you can pretty much add these two numbers up together. So instead of 11 million DPS, it's actually 22 million DPS. And because of this aspect, this pretty much means that Vol Lightning Strike or Lightning Strike is unbeatable for strike skills in terms of damage. And Lightning Strike also has a pretty high damage effectiveness of around like 200 plus percent. Now, Lightning Strike is a projectile skill, so that means it can pierce. And pierce is pretty much needed for clear, but you can get pierce on the alternate quality of anomalous Lightning Strike. You can also get pierce on the tree over here. So if you go look over here, you can see that you can get pierce with piercing shots, and you can actually pick that up with Thread of Hope. And you can also get pierce on your glove implicit, which you can see here as the suppression roll. So basically, Pierce is needed or the skill is going to feel really bad for mapping. And this build does take advantage of using Secrets of Suffering for alternate ailments. So you can use Brittle, Scorch, and Sap. Brittle gives you 15% base crit. Scorch gives you 30% Elipen, and Sap makes the enemy do 20% less damage. Now for the Ascendancies, you want to pick up Warbringer first. Now what Warbringer does is whenever you use a Warcry below 25 rage, you gain rage based on how much Warcry power you use. And if you use Red Blade Banner, you'll get maximum rage. Aspect of Carnage is second, and this gives us pretty much 40% more damage and 10% increased damage taken. And then we want to take Flawless Savagery. And then lastly, we want Blitz for 40% more attack speed. And we take Blitz last because it actually gives you reduce crit, which is pretty annoying until we get alternate ailments. And for the Forbidden Flame and Flesh Jewel, you want to use Blitz or Rite of Ruin. Now, for the Pantheon, you want to use Major Pantheon, which is Soul of the Brine King, and this gives you freeze immunity, partial stun immunity, stun and block recovery, and reduced chill effect of 50%. The Minor Pantheon, you use the Soul of Garu Khan, which gives you reduced shock effect. And if you craft like reduced effect on your gloves or rings, then you can pretty much become shock immune. And for bandits, you want to kill all the bandits for 2 passive points. And if you're actually ailment immune because you use like the boot Eldritch Implicit, or you're able to get ailment immune on your build, you can take the Soul of Lunaris and Yugo instead, which gives you reduced curse effect. And then this one gives you like reduced elemental damage if you've been hit recently, which should always be up. Now let's go look at the skill tree. Now there are so in the PoB you could pretty much tinker around the skill tree, and I do include a lot of different ones. So this is like the regular mapping setup that you'll be using at the start. And then there's also one for 2x inspired learnings, and this is the one you should be using when you're mapping. And then you'll have one where you want to use 1 cluster. So this is where you start sacrificing points on a tree to put into a cluster setup. And then there's also a 2 cluster setup. So you can see here, the more clusters you have, the more damage you'll be doing, because clusters are pretty much just very, very overpowered. And whenever you can choose to drop points on a tree to put into clusters, it's almost always going to be worth it in terms of damage. So basically, you can see here for the tree for regular mapping, you pretty much have to go start from Berserker, the Marauder area. You want to always take these, you need to take these Warcry nodes in order to get Rage whenever you use a Warcry. And then you want to make sure you get the Fortify stuff here. This is Call to Arms, so you can use General's Cry. And this makes your Warcry's instant cast, so you can put it on left click. Now we take these nodes over here for Onslaught effect, and it gives you armor and evasion during Onslaught, which should be up almost all the time with Perseverance. Now when you want to go over here, you can get Frenzy Charges, the Mark Mastery, which gives you 10% chance to gain Frenzy Charge when you hit a marked enemy, and this gives you culling, and this is point blank. Now this is the tree for Omni, so I'll probably make a pre-Omni version because you don't actually need these attribute nodes unless you're using Omni. And this tree does allow you to take suppression nodes here and suppression nodes here to fix your suppression until you get 100% spell suppression. And this crit mastery thing is pretty good because it gives you increased effect of ailments, which helps out Brittle early on before you get a lot of damage. And this is your cookie cutter dagger elusive node that scales your multi with elusive effect. And then this claw mastery is increased effect of elusive, which gives you a bunch of multi. So if you actually take these nodes out over here, you'll see that your multi goes from 544% to 616%. So these nodes are super, super effective. Now this tree does use 2 aura clusters because the aura effect does scale your armor and evasion. So you can see here in this pod we have 42k evasion and 42k armor. And the life total is not too bad. It's like 44.9k life, so the build is relatively tanky. But basically, the tree is pretty good, and I will be releasing a leveling guide because the tree does look like it travels a lot, and it might be hard to figure out how do you actually level with the tree, but it's actually very, very simple. Now we'll be going over the cluster jewels that we'll have to be using, and these are more late game options because you can see here in the PoB that you actually don't need to use any cluster jewels for a long time. But basically, large clusters, we want to use attack damage clusters. So you can see here, claw damage deals attacks. And you want to use Feed to Fury, Fuel to Fight, and Martial Prowess. Now, a lot of people do ask me, how do you actually trigger the leech? Because it says here on Feed to Fury is 30% increased attack damage while leeching and attack speed while leeching. We're able to trigger this because every single time you attack, you spend mana, and the mana leech rate is not enough to counteract how much actually mana you're spending, right? So you'll almost always be leeching as long as you're attacking. Now for the medium cluster, you want to use a crit cluster or pressure point and quick getaway later on. Now this, I'm not really sure if you're always going to be using this. This is more of an option when you're super, super high level. But a lot of times it might just be better to not use a medium cluster. Now a large cluster will almost always beat out points on tree for efficiency, but you may need a higher level. The reasoning behind this is because every single time you use a large cluster, you open up 2 jewel sockets. And jewel sockets are really, really good, especially for allowing you to put in more unique jewels or quad damage jewels, right? So cluster jewels are MVP. Now, unique jewels are something that you'll be using a lot. And the two mandatory ones, I think, are Interrogation to get Secrets of Suffering, and this allows you to get alternate ailments. Mantra of Flames is a pretty insane DPS increase, and I think it's pretty much unbeatable. So if you can look at this pop here, Mantra of Flames is actually roughly, it's actually only a 4% DPS increase. Oh, wait, it's like a 10% DPS increase, right? And this doesn't even include like all the buffs you could get while mapping. So Mantra of Flames, unbeatable jewel. And next up, if you want to do mapping or juice map farming, you want to get 2 Inspired Learnings that pretty much give you a mini Headhunter. And Inspired Learnings are a lot more efficient this time around with how they reworked rare modifiers. And later on, you want to get a Watcher's Eye, and you want to get Anger Multi if possible, and Precision Attack Damage if you're actually running Precision on your build. Now, this is something that's really, really late game, which is the Impossible Escape. And this could be something you use. This is the Steel Mage Jewel. So if you take it like Chaos Inoculation, you can actually get an additional curse. You can get Influence, which is more aura effect, that you can get some more mana reservation efficiency. And you can get 25% chance to avoid ailments. But this is probably something that's going to be really, really expensive. Another thing you can consider is maybe using a Thread of Hope here if you're not using Inspires. And if you use the Thread of Hope, you could actually pick up Piercing Shots, which gives you +2 pierce. You can pick up this Force of Nature. You can also take this node, Primeval Force. So there's a lot of different options for this build and a lot of jewels that you can possibly use. Now, for generic jewels that you might want to pick up, you want to probably get a Corrupted Blood Jewel so you don't die to CB. Now, the best mods to look for in regular jewels are pretty much attack speed with claws, crit multi with one-handed melee weapons, generic attack speed, attributes, ally resist to fix the resist and attribute problems. Another option you could do is you could use Abyss Jewels with life and flat ally damage to attacks and claws. There's also mods like damage penetrates elemental resistance if you haven't killed recently, percent attack speed if you dealt a crit recently, global crit multi, and accuracy rating if you're having accuracy issues. So next up, we have the skill links for the build. Now, I did try to flesh it out a lot more so that this actually works perfectly. So for your main skill, you want to use Lightning Strike, Trinity, Nightblade, Inspiration, Multi-Strike, and Elemental damage with attacks. Now, this time around, we're not using added cold or added lightning because we're actually running 2 damage auras. So we already have a lot of flat added damage. Now, for our movement skill, we want to be using Rolling Blades and Flame Dash. Now for auras, we want to be running Grace, Determination, Wrath, and Defiance banner. And this is the aura we're going to be putting on our Divine Blessing, which is Anger. Divine Blessing, increased duration, and life tap. With the increased duration, the aura should last around 18 seconds, I think. So it should be not that bad to press. So you just press this one button every 18 seconds. Now for buffs, you want to use Totem for Ancestral Protector, General's Cry, which is what your War Cry for Rage. And a reason behind using General's Cry is that it's the shortest cooldown for a War Cry. Berserk is something you want to press whenever you reach high rage. And then our defensive castle damage taken setup is castle damage taken Molten Shell. Now we don't want to use Vol Molten Shell because we want to use Vol Lightning Strike so that we won't split charges for souls. And we want to use Withering Step to reset the elusive effect, so we're always at the highest amount of elusive. Now for the Mark on Hit setup, we want to use Assassin's Mark and Mark on Hit. And you need to make sure you have enough mana left over to for the Assassin's Mark to actually cast. Now, in terms of the playstyle is something that you kind of need to get used to. There's a lot of buttons to press. So you want to put General's Cry on left click for rage generation. When you put General's Cry on left click and it's an instant cast, it will cast it pretty much on cooldown every time you're moving. So what this means is that every 4 seconds, your War Cry, and if you're below 25 rage, you will go to maximum rage pretty much as long as you're next to a boss or a lot of mobs. And you want to be spamming Withering Step on cooldown to reset elusive. So you can either like choose to macro it or use the numlock trick, or you can just spam the button over and over again. And you want to press Berserk when you're at high rage. And you want to do this because Berserk gives you a big clear speed boost, a big movement speed boost, and a big damage boost, right? So you want to maintain high Berserk uptime while mapping. Now for single target boss fights, you want to drop down your Ancestral Protector totem. Ancestral Protector gives you a large amount of attack speed. Now you want to use Vault Lightning Strike for your bosses. So a lot of times when you're doing mapping, you want to save your Vault Lightning Strike for bosses. You pretty much don't really need Vault Lightning Strike for just general mapping. Now, Vol Lightning Strike snapshots your damage, right? So before we use the Vol Lightning Strike, we want to have this checklist up to make sure we get the maximum amount of damage possible. We want to make sure we have high rage and we have Berserk up. We want to make sure we have the Ancestral Protector totem placed. We want to make sure that the boss won't TP away. A lot of times when you're doing Maven or you're doing Cyrus, if you put down Vol Lightning Strike and the boss just disappears or teleports away, then you pretty much just wasted your whole burst window, right? And you're doing 0 damage. You want to make sure you press all your flasks because our flasks are pretty much damaged at this point. And you want to press focus if you have. So if you have like double damage while focused, that double damage would get snapshotted into the Vol Lightning Strike, making you do massive amounts of damage. If you don't do this checklist, you could pretty much be doing 0 damage, especially if the boss teleported away or something like that. So make sure to follow this checklist. And I did make it a lot easier because we're only using 1 totem now instead of 2 totems. Oh yeah, and you want to make sure that you have your Divine Blessing aura up of anger, right? You want to make sure that this aura is actually up. I forgot to put that down. Now, in terms of defenses of the build, for like wondering why is this character actually so tanky, the main reason we're so tanky is we're running Determination, Grace, and Defiance banners. So this results in around like 35 to 40k armor. So you can see here in this pub, it's like 40k armor, 40k evasion. Now, it's also easy 100% spell suppression because we're no longer using Red Blade Banner. We'll be using a rare shield. And you'll probably be using a rare chest piece early on. So getting 100% spell suppression should not be too bad, especially when we're taking 2 spell suppression nodes here on the tree. Now, we do have a lot of recovery for life gain on hit due to the claw implicit. Elusive is also a huge defensive layer and gives around 40% chance to avoid all damage. Now, Withering Step, a lot of people wonder, why do you want to use Withering Step? The reason behind using Withering Step is that Withering Step removes the elusive, right? So it removes your existing elusive buff, and then Nightblade reapplies it on Lightning Strike. And because we pretty much will have 100% crit, that means that immediately we'll reapply the elusive stacks. The elusive stack, or elusive is a buff that drains down for a maximum value to 0 unless you remove it with Withering Step. We also have a decent amount of block from the shield, which helps out a little bit. So this is like a 26% chance to block shield. And we can also reach like 84% max res if we decide to use a brass dome and we use nodes on the tree and we use a shield that could actually get +2 maximum resist, right? So it's very, very easy to actually get a lot of max res, and max res in conjunction with spell suppression should pretty much make your character near unkillable. So now it's pretty much the gear section. So shield, we want to use a rare shield. It should be evasion based, so you can get spell suppression roll on it. You want to get life, spell suppression. You can also get elemental resist, attack speed, chance to block. Increased maximum resist is also extremely, extremely good. Now, if you have an open suffix, you want to try to craft on this mod here, double damage while focused, which should help out your Vol Lightning Strike window or damage window a lot. Now, for helmet, for Berserker, the best enchant is Berserk effect. If you're farming juice maps and you want to use a shrine dominated strategy on the Atlas passive tree, which pretty much everyone should, you should use the goal. The goal is pretty much best in slot. Before you get the interrogation for alternate ailments, Gale Sight, this helmet here is BIS because it gives you brittle, which gives you easy 100% crit. And Berserker does have a little bit of a problem getting 100% crit without blitz charges. Now, late game, you want to use a Blizzard Crown. But before Blizzard Crown, you can look for any armor and evasion base. The reason behind a Blizzard Crown is it has a lot of flat cold damage. Now, for the Blizzard Crown or a rare helmet, you want life, you want Elliot and Chaos Res, you want attributes if you're using Omni, and you want percent evasion and armor if possible, spell suppression, and this mod is actually pretty strong. Physical damage for hits taken as fire damage. Now, Amulet is pretty much a no-brainer, and it's going to be Omni, Omni, Omni. This Anointment this time, we're going to be using Sovereignty. I know a lot of people didn't like using Panopticon Anointment because they thought it was too much of a tooltip warrior thing. So we're going to be using Sovereignty, and it's actually needed to run our auras. Now, the amulet before endgame of getting Omni, you can use a rare amulet with life, crit multi, elemental damage with attacks, flat elemental damage with attacks, or accuracy rating. So we can pretty much use a rare until we can actually afford Omni. Now, in terms of a chest, late game, you of course want to use Brass Dome for the max res. Before you get the Brass Dome, you can use a rare chest, and the rare chest can just have life, it can have spell suppression, You have attributes if you're using Omni, and this mod is actually kind of good if you do decide to take Ghost Shroud, which is gain 10% of maximum life as extra maximum energy shield. And if you want to use Eldritch Implicits on the rare chest, you should use Aura Effect, and then damage Aura Effect for like Wrath or Anger or something like that, or Determination. So next up we have rings, and I do think that Mark of the Elder ring is probably unbeatable with the amount of damage that it gives you, with 80% attack damage and this much flat added cold damage. But before you use Mark of the Elder and a Shaper ring, you can also decide to use just 2 attribute rings for Omni. So you can see here, this is an example ring with a lot of strength, a dex, accuracy, and then it has life, and it pretty much just has crafted on non-channeling skills have minus mana cost. Now you kind of want to always craft this non-channeling skills minus mana cost because this helps out your Assassin's mark on hit, and it'll also help out with your Whirling Blaze mana cost so that you won't be draining your mana while moving throughout the map. So make sure to craft this on if possible. This ring is actually pretty easy to make if you use a Veiled Chaos Sword, but you finish the suffixes first. Now, next up, we have the claw, and a lot of people wonder, how do you actually make the claw? Well, the answer is you want to craft the claw of essences. You can use a lightning damage essence, you can use a cold damage, fire damage, you can use attack speed, or you can use a crit chance. So you can see here, this is like kind of a basic claw that you could probably make with an essence or something like that. So this is just like fire damage, low cold and low lightning damage, attack speed, and crit chance. Now, late game, there's actually something that I thought about, and you can actually craft on hits can't be evaded. And hits can't be evaded means that you don't need to worry about accuracy rolls on your gear or taking any accuracy notes on a tree. Now, hits can be evaded is actually 3 exalts. So you can see here in this like pseudo late game claw, this thing actually has multi-mod and hits can be evaded. So this claw actually costs like 5x or so to make, or actually 6x just in terms of the crafted mods. But before that, you can also just craft on alley penetration for the prefix. If on suffix, you can craft on crit chance, strength, and int, or you can craft on double damage while focused, right? So you don't really need to get hits can't be evaded, but if you don't have hits can't be evaded on your claw, you do have to fix the accuracy issue on your ring or something like that, or gloves. Now next up we have the belt. Now the best endgame option, of course, is going to be Mage Blood. Headhunter could also be really good if you're doing like juice maps of some sort. Now Perseverance is actually the best option hands down before Mage Blood. Perseverance gives you around 200% attack damage when you have 40k armor and evasion. Now, before Perseverance, you can use a Stygian, or you can use a Letter Belt or something like that. Now, what you're looking for on a rare belt is max life, resist, chaos resist, or elemental damage of attack skills. And you can use an Abyss Jewel if you're using a Stygian. But pretty much you want to save up for Perseverance. It might be one of the first buys that you want to save for because it does give you Onslaught on boss fights, and it gives you an insane amount of attack damage. Now, next up, we have boots. Now, boots are kind of an interesting option. You have the uber endgame option, which is using elevated onslaught and elevated tailwind boots. But before that, you can pretty much just use any life movement speed boot. And if you have Omni, you can get attributes. You can look for spell suppression. You can look for chaos res. So you can see here, this is a pair of very generic boots with some strength and dex, chaos res. Now, the best enchant that you can use is probably flat lightning damage if you haven't killed recently. I think Pen is also really good before Omni if you can somehow get that. And if you're mapping, you can get flat fire damage if you've killed recently, which is really, really good. Any flat damage is extremely strong. Now, if before you use influence boots, you can also use Eldritch Implicits, and Eldritch Implicits are pretty good for getting ailment avoidance. You can also get action speed, or you can get elusive effect, which are also very, very strong. Now, next up, we have gloves. Now, the best endgame option for gloves is any armor and evasion base. Now, you can get good stats like life, you can get Ellie res, chaos res, you can also get attack speed, and attributes are also really good, like right here for Omni, and you can also get accuracy rating to fix your chance to hit. Now, Eldritch Implicits, pretty much you'll always want strike skills, target 2 additional nearby enemies, and then pierce, right? So this is pretty much very, very important in order to get good clear speed. And you can also craft on attack and cast speed while focused, or you can craft on this mod here, which is increased damage while leeching, which pretty much should always be activated. Now, lastly, we have the Flasks. Now, Flasks, you probably want to use a unique Flask of Bottle Faith later on if you could afford it, but you pretty much don't really need it. You could just use a Life Flask, and you want to use a Seeding Divine Life Flask of Sealing for bleed removal. And for your utility flask, you want to use a Granite, you want to use a Jade Flask, you want to use a Diamond Flask, and you want to use a Quartz Flask. Or you can use a Quicksilver Flask, but you should probably use a Quartz Flask for the phasing. Now you can see here for the suffixes, you have percent armor, percent evasion is really good, percent attack speed is also super strong, and percent crit chance. Now you can also swap out the percent crit chance for less effective curses so that you don't get completely destroyed by curses if you roll on your map. And for the prefix, for the flask, we want to use flagellants, which gives you gain charges when you're hit by an enemy. So you can see here, all these flasks are gain charges if you're hit by an enemy, right? So overall, this build is absolutely amazing for doing all content. I did level with this build all the way to a level 100 in Simulacrums, which is pretty much the hardest content that you can do. Steel Mage's Jewel Impossible Escape allows for a lot of cool options, and I do think that Steel Mage's Jewel will allow me to get ailment immune if you take the Chaos Inoculation, so maybe have this on a live search. But I'm pretty sure this Jewel is going to be like 50-60x bare minimum. Perseverance is a complete game changer that I pretty much neglected in 3.17 because I'm an idiot. If you look at the damage, Perseverance 11.8 mil, no Perseverance 6.8. So this belt roughly doubles your damage and it gives you Onslaught. So this thing is pretty much unbeatable and it gives you a lot of armor and evasion. And another good thing about using a Perseverance setup is it forces us to run Grace and Determination. And last league, a lot of people complain about dying because they didn't run Grace. And this time around, you have 83% evasion chance, so your character will be a lot tankier against hits compared to last league. And this should be a very smooth league start for most people, especially if they can get the belt. Only downside for the belt is that it might be pretty expensive because there are other content creators pushing Champion Lightning Strike, which also uses the belt. Now, lastly, you want to make sure to swap out a Spectral Helix ASAP. Spectral Helix is not something you want to be playing for a long time. The skill feels terrible in mapping, and as soon as you can swap to Spectral Lightning Strike, you should swap as soon as possible. I cannot stress it enough. There's a lot of people who straight up almost want to quit the league because they've been playing Spectral Helix for too long. But basically, I can put my satisfaction 100% customer satisfaction guaranteed. And I do think that if you try this build out, it will probably be one of the most fun builds you can play. And I also think that it is one of the strongest league starters that you can play. So thanks for watching, everyone. If you have any questions about the build, let me know down in the comments below. And I hope you find more mirrors, exalts, and mage bloods than me. And see you next time. Bye.